So a little while back I made an add-on review video reviewing AutoBake, a really great Blender add-on for texture baking. But since releasing that video, the add-on has gotten some big updates and improvements. So in this video I'll be reviewing the new version of AutoBake, AutoBake 2. So the add-on creator sent this over for me to review, so thank you so much for letting me try out this add-on. And I do have an affiliate link to the add-on in the description on the Blender Market, so if you'd like to purchase the add-on, if you use my affiliate link, I'll earn a small commission, so that's also a great way to help support this channel. But I only review content on my channel that I really stand behind. And after watching this video, if you'd like to get even deeper into all the features of the add-on, then they also released a really detailed documentation of the add-on, and it goes into lots of detail covering all the features of the add-on. And I'll have detailed timestamps in the video description and in the YouTube timeline if you want to jump to a specific part or go back to a specific part in the video. And at the end of this video, I'll also be covering how to texture bake high poly details to a low poly mesh using a normal map using the add-on. So for an example in this video, I'm going to be texture baking this snowman. So the snowman has a few different objects that we're going to be baking, and there's also a few different procedural materials like a simple wood material and some snow and the carrot nose. So once you've downloaded the zip file of the add-on, what you can do is just drag and drop the zip file into Blender, and then you can just let go, and then you can click on OK, and that's going to install the add-on. Now if you go here to edit and go to Blender's user preferences, you can click over here on the get extensions, and if you search for it, you can see here is the AutoBake add-on in the extensions. Also, if you go to the add-ons tab and then search for AutoBake, there we go, we have the AutoBake add-on enabled. And then also click on the Save Preferences button unless the autosave preferences is already turned on, and that'll save the preferences so the add-on will always be turned on in future projects. So to get to the add-on settings, you can go here to the render properties, and then you can see there's a tab here for AutoBake. And what I'm going to do is click on these dots here and just drag it up to the top so I can see all the settings at the top, and let's just open up the add-on settings. Now the first thing I need to do is properly UV unwrap the objects so there's not any overlapping, and it will bake correctly onto the image textures. And if you don't know how to do UV unwrapping in Blender and want to learn the basics, you can definitely check out my UV unwrapping for beginners tutorial. Link to that is in the description. Now what I could do is go over here to the UV editing workspace and just select all the objects and go into edit mode, and you can see all the objects are overlapping and the UV editing is not very good. So what I could do for an object like this, if I just want to do a basic UV unwrap for texture baking, is I could hit the U button and I could go to unwrap, and I could do the smart UV project, and then here on the island margin I could turn it to a small number like a 0.006 and unwrap this. And so what this is going to do is just going to break up the texture and kind of lay everything down flat. Now I'm just going to click right back here to go to the layout, because the add-on actually has a really great setting to automatically do the smart UV project. So you can UV unwrap the object manually if you want to, but what I'm going to do is use the add-on's UV unwrap settings. So here on the add-on settings, if I minimize the settings, let's go to Elements, and then I can go to Object, and then I can open up UV to edit the UVs. Now right now the target UV is set to render, so for this setting it would render the current UV map that we have on the object. What I'm going to do instead is click on the Override button, and the Override button is going to use the Smart UV Project. So this way when we hit bake and actually bake the textures, it's going to use these UV unwrap settings. So what I'm going to do is take this island margin and turn it to like a 0.006. If I turn the island margin up to just a small number like 0.006, it'll make sure there's a little bit of space in between each UV island. Now I thought it was important to also mention what to do if you have an image texture on your object and you want to texture bake that image texture to a new UV map. So I just have a monkey head with this brick texture, but if I go into edit mode, you can see I scaled up the UVs, but this would not work well for texture baking because the UV island is going outside of the texture space. So you would have issues when you're baking this. So in this case, what you'd want to do is texture bake from this UV map to a new UV map when it actually bakes. And there's a way to do that with the add-on. So to do this, what you'd want to do is click down here to go to the object data properties, make sure you have the object selected when you do this, and I can close these settings and I'll open up the UV maps. So here's the default UV map. This is the one that we can see right here, but what I can do is click on the plus here to make a new UV map, and I can just call this baked UV map, or whatever you want to call it. So now what I can do is go into edit mode, and I can scroll my mouse wheel over here, and I can click here, and I can make sure I'm selecting the new UV map. Then what I can do is just hit the U button and I can just do the unwrap. I'll just do like Smart UV Project, turn up the island margin to a small number, click on unwrap, and now it's unwrapped it. So just UV unwrap the object correctly so that it's inside the texture space and there aren't any overlapping of the UV islands. So this one here, this is what the texture currently is using, but this one here, this is what it's actually going to bake as. Now to tell the add-on to bake from this UV map to the new UV map, what you want to do is go up here again to the add-on settings. So go to the render properties, we'll go to auto bake, and we're going to open up the elements, we're going to open up the object, and then open up the UV. And here on the target UV, we're going to change this to a custom UV map. Now here on the name here, we can change this to the baked UV map. So this way when we hit the bake button, it's going to bake it to the new UV map that we've created. It is really important though to make sure you go back here to the object data properties and make sure you are previewing the first UV map. That's important when you bake it. So it bakes it using the first UV map, but then it will bake it to the second UV map. So just make sure you have the original UV map selected. For this snowman character, it's not actually using any image textures. I'm just using procedural textures, so I don't need to use any separate UV map. So I'm now going to add the different images for baking. So let's scroll right up here. Let me just close these settings just to minimize it so it looks a bit nicer. Let's open up the bake list and we can now add different items to the bake list. So we're going to click on the plus here to add a new image, and on default it is the base color. Now right here you can change the resolution. So I like to bake to 4K. So what you can do is click on these arrows here and it's going to bring it up by increments. So this is a 1K map, a 2K map, and you can go all the way up to like 8K or even higher. I'm just going to go to 4K, so 4096 by 4096. That is the standard resolution for baking a 4K texture. Now what I can also do is click on the plus here to add a new map, and then it says base color, but we need to change it. So if I click right here, we can change the bake type. So there are many different options that you can bake from. You can see there's so many different types of maps that you can bake. If you go up to the very top, these are probably the main ones that you're going to use. So like the normal, roughness, metallic, and base color. I'm next going to choose the roughness. Now, if you find this a bit annoying having to scroll up here and choose the different maps, what you can do is get rid of some of the previews in the add-on settings. So if you click on edit and go to the user preferences, what you can do is click on the add-ons tab. You can search for auto bake and just find the auto bake add-on. Then what you can do is go to the type visibility and you can click here on category and you can turn off some of these if you don't want to use them. So just for an example, I'm going to turn off these three here. So I've turned off these three. Now if I go back to the add-on and click here on the maps, you can see it's small enough to fit inside the Blender window. So now I can clearly see all the different maps. I'm just going to click on the minus here to get rid of the roughness map, and then I'll click here to add a new one. Another way to quickly add the maps is to click on the base color and you can hit R and that'll choose a roughness map. I'll click on the plus again, and then I'll click here to change the type, and I'll hit N for normal. And also if you were using a metallic map, you click on the plus, click here, and then hit M to use the metallic map. Now, none of these objects are metallic, so I don't need to bake a metallic map, so I'll click on the minus there to get rid of the metallic map. Now, you can also change the name here if you want to. So for example, on base color, if I wanted to, I could just change this to color or diffuse or albedo, whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to call it color. Now, another cool feature of the add-on is you can preview each one of the maps. So what I'm going to do is select all the objects, make sure they're all selected, and I'll just select this as the active object. Now I can hold down the control key and I can click here on the little texture icon. And so that is just going to preview the base color, or I can hold down the control key, select the roughness. So there's the roughness. So some parts are more shiny and other parts are more rough depending on the darkness and lightness. And then I can also hold down the control key and select the normal, and it's just going to show me the normal map. So this is useful just for previewing the textures and seeing how it's going to look. But I'll just hold down the control key and click again just to get rid of the preview. Now, if for some reason you want to disable one of the images in the bake list, you can also click on this plus icon. So for example, let's say the roughness and base color baked correctly, but maybe something was wrong with the normal map, so you want to rebake it. You could just turn off the base color and roughness, and then when you click on bake, it's only going to bake the texture maps which are checkmarked. But in this case, I want to keep them all on. Now on default with the add-on settings, it's going to create a separate base color, roughness, and normal for each one of the objects. So for each one of the objects, there's going to be 3 different texture maps. So you can do that if you want to. However, I want it to texture bake all of these to a single base color, roughness, and normal map. So to do this, we're going to click here on elements, and then we're going to go here to image. Then we're going to go here to texture and open up the texture tab, and I can just click on this shared enable. And this way, any objects that we have selected when we hit the bake button, they're all going to be baked to the same map. So I'll close the texture, close the image, and close the elements tab. Now if I open up the settings here and then open up the margin, we have this margin size here. And so the margin is basically going to add a little bit of bleed going outside of the UV islands. And this is important because if the island margin is turned to 0, then on the very edge of the UV maps, you're going to see kind of like some problems with the UVs and the texture isn't going to look correct. So normally on default, 16 should work great. I am, however, going to turn this to 8, so it's a little bit smaller, but probably somewhere between 8 and 16 will work fine for most objects. Now, just to explain what this is doing, if I go here to the UV editing, let's just zoom in here. And so right here at the very end of the UV map, if I just select this single object and go into edit mode, basically the island margin is going to add a little bit of bleeding going outside of the UV island. And so that is important because if it's turned to 0, you can have kind of glitches and issues on the edges of the UV islands once it's baked. So let's go back here to the layout. So let's close the margin and then close the settings. Now what you can also do is tell the add-on to automatically save all the image textures to files on your computer. So to do this, we're going to open up the elements and we're going to go here to image, and then we can go here to the export and let's click on the export button. So this way it's automatically going to export the textures as image files to our computer, and you can choose the file format. So for most things I'd use PNG. You could use JPEG if you want it to be a smaller file size, but I'm going to use PNG. Now we also need to open up the path here, and we need to set a path to where we want it to save the image textures. So let's click on the file icon. And here in my project files, I'll just set it in this folder where I have the Blender file and the other files, and I'll just click on select folder. So it's going to save the baked textures to that folder. Now if I click here on the folder type, there are two different options here. If I turn on this allow, this is going to create a separate folder, and it's going to put all the textures inside that folder. So that's very useful. I'm going to leave this on. Now if I turn on the subfolders, if I turn this on, it is going to create a separate folder for the roughness maps, the normal maps, and the color maps. So that's useful if you're like baking each object with different UV maps and you want to organize them. But in this case, I'm just going to turn this off. I just want all the maps to be in one folder. So let's close the folder. We can close the path. We can close the export and close the image, and finally close the elements. Now we can also tell the add-on to automatically plug up all the image textures into the principled shader once it's finished baking. So to do this, I'm going to open up the elements and I'm going to go to material, and then I can turn on final. Now if I open up the final tab, you can see there's a shader here, and I'm just going to keep it as principled because I want it to add the textures to a principled shader because that's what these objects are using. Now if I open up the object tab, you can see there is a material final right here, but then there's also an object final right here. Now if the material final is checkmarked, what it's going to do is it's going to create a new material, and it's going to plug up all the textures correctly. So then what you'll need to do is go to the shading tab, click on the drop down, and choose the new material with all the baked textures plugged up correctly. Now if you have the object final and the material final both checkmarked at the same time, what it's going to do is it's going to actually make a duplicate of the object, and with the duplicated object it's going to apply the baked textures. And so that way you can look around at the new object and make sure that it's baked it correctly and make sure everything looks correct. So I'm going to do this. So I'm going to turn on both the material final and the object final. Now with the object final, when it duplicates the object, it's going to have the object on top of itself because it's going to duplicate it and keep it where it is. But what we can do is change the offset. So I'm going to leave the offset set to X, and then here on the meters, I'm just going to turn this to 5. So this way it'll duplicate the object and place it about here, and that way we can just look at the object and make sure it baked it correctly. So I'm just going to turn that to 5 meters. Let's close these different settings here. So we can close this one here, close the final, and close the material. Now if we open up the image tab under elements, we can also add a custom name to the textures. So there's a prefix, which is going to be at the beginning. There's a suffix, which is at the end. So here on the prefix, I could just call this like snowman. And here on the suffix, I could just call this like texture. You can just call it whatever you want or just leave it how it is. And I'll just leave the bridge here on the default. So before you actually texture bake, I always recommend just pressing Ctrl S to save your file. Now to finally bake this, what I want to do is select all the objects, and whatever objects are selected, that is what the add-on is going to bake. So make sure you select all the objects, I'll save the file, and then I can click on auto bake and then click on OK, and it's going to start the bake. and you can see it's already duplicated that object there, and so this is a preview of the new bake texture. Now what's really cool about this is that you can also pause the bake if you want to, or cancel the bake if you remembered a setting that was incorrect, or maybe you're noticing that something is wrong, you can cancel the bake. Or if maybe you're doing a lot on your computer and you just want to pause it, maybe you are baking a lot of image textures, you can just pause it and then replay it when you're ready. And the bake has finished, and if for some reason the texture looks a bit off, one thing I found you can do is just go back to solid view and then go back into the rendered viewport mode if you're in rendered mode. And so there we go, we can preview the duplicated object. So this duplicated object has the bake textures, but as you can see, pretty much everything looks exactly the same. Now if I jump over to my file browser, you can see the add-on made a new folder called snowman, and then here we go, we have the snowman. You can see it used our custom name, so snowman color, it has the image texture size and then texture. So if I just open this up, here's the color map, here is the normal map, and here's the roughness map. Also, if I select all the objects and go to the UV editor, you can see if I zoom out here and just select all the objects, you can see it automatically UV unwrapped using Smart UV Project. And also if I click here, go to the shading workspace and select the new object, you can see it plugged up all the texture maps correctly. So we have the base color, we have the roughness and the normal. It's also plugged up the normal map, so it's converting it to normal data, and also it's set the color space to sRGB, that's correct for color maps, but in the other maps it's set to non-color. So everything's set up correctly. So let's go back over here to the layout. So because I like this, I like how it is, what I can do is click on the confirm button, and then I have this cool feature here called swap object. So I'll click on swap object and click on OK. So it's going to get rid of that preview object, and it's going to set the new object as the default object with the bake textures. So if I go over here to the shading workspace, we now have the new object with the bake textures. Now another awesome feature of the add-on is that you can bake high poly details to a low poly mesh using the add-on. So this is a head that I sculpted, and I used these files in my tutorial on how to do retopology for beginners, and I retopologized the sculpt to this low poly head model. But what I want to do is take all the high poly details of the sculpt and I want to apply it onto this low poly object. So let's go here to the render properties, and here on the auto bake, let's just drag this up to the top, and I'll open up the auto bake settings. So I now want to add a normal map, so it'll bake the high poly details to the low poly mesh. So I'll click on the plus here to add a new map. I can change this up to 4K, and if I click here on base color, I'll just hit N to add the normal map. Now to make it bake the high poly details to the low poly mesh, we want to scroll down here, and under the settings margin, we want to choose selected to active. Now I also want to turn on the source location to copy. I want to turn this on, and this way it's going to place the high poly object over the low poly object so they're on top of each other, so it'll know how to bake correctly the high poly details to the low poly mesh. I also want to checkmark the final object use active, and so what this will do is it'll make sure that the active object, or the last object that was selected, that's going to be the low poly object that it'll texture bake it to. So before we texture bake this, we'll just make sure that this is the active object. Now if I click over here to go to the UV editing workspace, you can see I've already added seams to the object, and I've already UV unwrapped it, so the islands aren't going outside the texture space and there aren't any overlapping islands. So I'll go back here to the layout. Now if we open up the settings tab and then go here to margin, again you can adjust the margin, so 16 should work fine, but I'm just going to change it down to 8, that'll work fine as well. We can also make the name, so let's close the margin and close the settings. We're going to open up the elements, we'll go to image, and then I can open up the name here, and on the prefix I'll call it head, on the suffix I can just call it like details or whatever you want to call it. Let's also go here to the image and then export. We'll click on export, so it'll automatically export the textures, and I'll save it as a PNG. And then to make the add-on so it automatically plugs up the new texture once it's baked, we'll turn on the material final and also the object final. Then we can choose a path for it to save the texture. So under elements, if you go here to texture, then you can go to path, and you can click on this file icon to save the texture. And I'm just going to save it in this folder with my project files where the blend file is, and I'll click on select folder. Then right here on the folder type, you could turn this on if you want to. That's going to create a new folder for the textures, but since I just have one texture, I'm just going to turn it off so it doesn't create a new folder. So let's press Ctrl S to save before I bake this. Let's scroll up here to the top, and I'm going to first select the high poly object, then hold down the shift key and select the low poly object last, so that the low poly object is the active object. And then we can click on auto bake, click on OK, and it'll go through and bake the texture, and you can see it took the high poly object and moved it on top of the low poly object. And now it is finished, so if I just hold down the Z button, go here to the material preview, you can see even though this is a low poly object, it baked all those details. It also like baked more of the details there, and also like it's really sharp right there. And let's click over here to go to the shading, and you can see here is the baked texture with the normal map. So again, let's go into the material preview to see this. So if I just mute the nodes, you can see here it is before, it's very low poly, and then here it is after with all the baked textures. So even though this is a sculpt and it's much higher poly, the low poly object still has all those high poly details. So that's how you can use the Auto Bake add-on. It's a really great Blender add-on for speeding up the baking process if you're doing lots of texture baking. So if you'd like to purchase the add-on, you can find the link to it in the description on the Blender Market, and my link is also an affiliate link, so if you purchase the add-on, then I'll earn a small commission, but it won't cost you anything extra. So that's a great way to help support this channel. So I hope you found this helpful, and thank you for watching.